On the morning of August 7th, 1981, a man stood on the edge of a silent lake in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. His name was Carl McCunn, 34 years old, a wildlife photographer, and at that moment, completely alone. In his hand, he held a small box of ammunition. He looked at it for a long time, then tossed it into the lake. The box hit the surface with a sharp splat that echoed off the water and the distant walls of the snow-capped mountains. It was such a small sound, but in the total silence of the Arctic Circle, it was deafening. Carl had no idea that sound would become the beginning of the end. For 5 months, he had been living out here by himself. No radio, no phone, no road, no sign of another human being for 100 miles in any direction. Just the cold wind, the lake, and the endless white horizon. He'd come here in early spring, dropped off by a tiny bush plane. He'd set up his camp on the lake's edge, a green tent, a cooking fire, a few crates of supplies, and his most precious cargo, 500 rolls of film. He was here chasing beauty, the kind of untouched wilderness most people would never see, and for a while, it was perfect. He spent his days tracking caribou herds, capturing the way the light bent across the tundra, waiting for wolves to appear through the morning mist. It was everything he'd dreamed of: silence, freedom, isolation. But now it was August 7th, the end of his 5-month expedition, the day his plane was supposed to return. He looked up at the pale sky and listened for the low hum of an engine. Nothing, just wind. That didn't worry him at first. After all, he'd only arranged the pickup date, not the time. At some point today, he told himself, his friend Rory, the bush pilot who'd dropped him off, would come flying over that ridge. So he waited. He packed his gear neatly by the shoreline. Camera, film, clothes, food, the few things he had left. Then, thinking the plane might not have room for everything, he decided to lighten his load. That's why he was tossing his ammo boxes into the lake, one after another, watching them sink below the surface. He didn't think he'd need them anymore. When he threw the 5th box, a cold breeze cut across the water. He zipped his parka up to his chin and shivered. It was supposed to be summer, but summer in the Arctic Circle still meant freezing nights. And even though he loved this life, the solitude, the challenge, the wild, Carl was ready to go home. He missed his friends. He missed his father. He missed warmth. He reached for his final box of ammo, ready to throw it, when a deep, mournful howl rolled across the lake. A wolf. Carl froze. He listened. The sound echoed again, closer this time. And then, maybe out of instinct, maybe out of caution, he decided to hold on to that last box, just in case. He stuffed it into his bag and walked along the shore to check the fishing net he'd set the night before. 2 trout wriggled inside. Dinner. He cleaned them, started a fire, and cooked them slowly, the smell of smoke and fish mixing in the cold air. As he ate, he kept glancing up, scanning the horizon, waiting for that tiny speck in the sky, the one that meant salvation. But the sky stayed empty. When the meal was done, he opened his diary, a small notebook that had become his only companion, and wrote about the day, waiting for pickup. Weather clear, lake calm, no plane yet. Then he packed the last of his things, lined them up neatly by the water, and sat on his old metal trunk. He waited. Hours passed. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, a rare thing in this part of Alaska, where daylight stretches for nearly 20 hours in summer. If the sun was setting, that meant it was close to midnight, and that meant his ride wasn't coming. Carl stared at the lake as darkness crept across the ice-blue surface. He tried to stay calm. Maybe his friend got delayed. Maybe the weather changed somewhere down the flight path. He reset his tent, crawled inside his sleeping bag, and told himself tomorrow, the plane would come. But tomorrow came and went. No plane, then another day. And another, still nothing. And slowly, a sick realization began to creep into Carl's mind. He remembered the night he and Rory had made their plan, 6 months earlier, sitting in a bar, laughing, beers in hand. He remembered asking Rory, "You can pick me up August 7th, right?" And Rory had said, "Yeah, probably, but I'll have to check my schedule." Carl had never followed up. He'd just assumed. Now, staring into the empty sky, it hit him. Rory wasn't coming. He was trapped, and worse, no one knew he was here. Carl wasn't the kind of man people kept tabs on. He traveled constantly, disappearing into the wild for months at a time. He never told people where he was going, or when he'd be back. The last time he'd gone missing for a while, his father had gotten worried and called the police. When Carl returned and found out, he'd been furious. He told his dad, "Don't ever do that again. If I'm late, I'm fine." So this time, no one would report him missing. He was utterly alone, and the worst part, winter was coming. Carl's mind spun through his options. He had 2. 1, stay put, survive off the land, and hope that somehow someone might stumble upon him before winter buried the world in snow. 2, pack up and hike out, 75 miles through rough, unmapped wilderness filled with rivers, cliffs, and wolves, to reach the nearest settlement, Fort Yukon. Option 1 meant slow starvation. Option 2 meant probable death. He stared out across the lake, trying to weigh which sounded worse. Finally, he sighed, trudged to one of his rabbit snares, and smiled. He'd caught one. He skinned it, cooked it, and ate every bite, staring into the firelight. Maybe I can survive here, he thought, at least until help comes. But then, from the distance, a sound, faint but unmistakable, the hum of an engine. Carl froze. Then he bolted from the fire, scanning the horizon, and there it was, a plane. It was small, glinting silver in the sun, flying low and slow directly toward him. Carl's heart pounded. He was saved. He dashed to his tent, grabbed the brightest thing he owned, an orange sleeping bag, and sprinted back to the shore. He waved it over his head, shouting, "Hey! Hey!" The plane dipped lower, so close now he could see the Alaska State Trooper insignia on the tail. A rescue plane. His friends must have alerted the authorities after all. It passed right over his camp, so low that Carl could see the pilot's face. For one glorious second, their eyes met. Carl laughed, tears in his eyes, and pumped his fist in the air, yelling, "Yes, I'm here!" The plane flew past, then banked hard and turned back. Carl jumped up and down, cheering, as it made another low pass over the camp. He's looking for a landing spot, Carl thought. He rushed to gather his things, packing frantically. He'd be leaving in minutes. But as he looked up again, the plane was climbing, and then it kept going, higher, farther, until it disappeared completely over the horizon. Carl stood there for a long time, staring at the empty sky. He couldn't understand. The pilot had seen him. He'd seen him. Why didn't he land? That night, Carl lay awake in his tent, listening to the endless silence. Maybe the terrain was too rough, he reasoned. Maybe the pilot had to go back and get a float plane. Maybe tomorrow. To distract himself, he looked for something to read. He'd read every book, every magazine, even reread his diary a dozen times. Then, digging through his pack, he found his hunting license. He unfolded it, reading the small print under the safety section, rules for signaling aircraft in emergencies, and then his heart stopped. It said, "When signaling for help, raise both arms above your head to form a V. This means pick me up. One arm raised means all okay. Do not wait." Carl stared at the paper. Then he remembered. That pilot had seen him pump his fist in the air. One arm, all okay. The pilot thought he didn't need help. Carl dropped the license, his hands trembling. The weight of what he'd done hit him all at once. That single gesture, that doubt, that tiny innocent mistake had sealed his fate. Carl sat inside his tent for hours that night, staring at the flickering light of his dying fire. He kept replaying it in his mind. That moment when the plane circled, when the pilot looked right at him, when he raised his arm. He could still see the pilot's face, calm, professional, and leaving. He whispered to himself, almost pleading with the dark, "No! He'll come back. He has to come back." But he knew. Deep down, he knew the truth. No one was coming. He was completely alone. The days that followed blurred together. The lake began to freeze around the edges. The air grew thinner, sharper. Every morning the ground was coated with frost. Carl rationed what food he had left. A few cans, some dried meat, and the rabbit traps he reset every night. But even that wouldn't last. When the first snow fell, soft flakes drifting silently through the gray sky, he realized the Arctic winter had already begun. And once that winter arrived in full, it wouldn't let go. Carl's body was tough. He had always been built for adventure, but now it wasn't just about endurance. It was about surviving isolation, something far crueler than cold. He talked to himself sometimes. He wrote in his diary every day, long entries filled with details, thoughts, and little fragments of hope. He wrote about the weather, about the wolves he heard howling at night, about the feeling of being so far from everything human that even his own voice sounded strange. And he kept telling himself, just hold out. Someone will notice you're gone. But no one did. By late September, the lake was a solid sheet of ice. His fishing days were over, the rabbits grew scarce, even the birds had vanished. Carl built crude snow shelters to shield himself from the wind, but the storms kept getting worse. He'd wake up covered in frost, his breath hanging in the air like smoke. The cold became a living thing, creeping into his bones, wrapping around him, refusing to let go. He stopped counting the days. Then, one afternoon, something changed. He was outside, breaking branches for firewood, when he spotted movement across the frozen lake. At first, he thought it might be a moose, but then he saw the glint of metal. A plane. Far in the distance, flying low, Carl dropped the wood and sprinted toward the shoreline, waving his arms, shouting until his throat went raw. But the plane kept its distance, miles away following some path across the horizon. He collapsed to his knees in the snow, sobbing, the sound lost in the wind. That was the last time he ever saw another aircraft. By early October, the reality was undeniable. He was running out of food. He tried everything. He boiled leather from his boots, chewed on scraps of bark, even melted snow to fill his stomach. The wolves came closer now. He'd hear them at night, circling just beyond the light of his fire. Their howls filled the air like a dirge, echoing off the frozen lake. Sometimes he thought about shooting one, not out of fear, but hunger. But he couldn't risk wasting a bullet. He had only that one last box of ammunition. He told himself he'd save it for when it truly mattered. November came. The wind howled day and night. The temperature dropped below zero. Carl's body began to betray him, his fingers and toes blackened with frostbite. He could no longer feel his hands when he wrote in his diary. The pages were stiff with ice, yet still he wrote. Each day, he left a message to whoever might one day find his body. Simple, quiet entries. Cold, hungry, wolves nearby, thinking of Dad. Still hope someone will come. Then came November 26th, Thanksgiving Day. The wind outside screamed across the ice. Carl lay inside his tent, shivering violently, too weak to sit up. His food was gone. His firewood was gone. His strength was fading fast. He opened his diary one last time and stared at the empty page. After a long moment, he pressed his pencil to the paper and wrote a single sentence. They say it doesn't hurt. He set the diary down beside his rolls of film. The one thing he had risked everything to capture. Then he reached for his rifle. A single gunshot cracked across the frozen lake, echoing into the mountains. And then, silence. Months later, in February 1982, the Alaska State Troopers returned to that same lake on a routine patrol. They saw the tent first, half buried in snow, its fabric torn by wind. Inside, they found Carl's body, lying peacefully in his sleeping bag. His rifle rested beside him. Next to him sat a small diary and stacks of carefully wrapped film canisters, each labeled and dated. The troopers read his final entries, piecing together the story of a man who had loved the wild so deeply that it had ultimately claimed him. When they reached that final line, "They say it doesn't hurt," one of the officers quietly closed the notebook and looked out across the lake. It was still, empty, the same as the day Carl had first arrived. They say that in those final days, Carl wasn't afraid, that he met his end the way he had lived, with quiet dignity surrounded by the wilderness he adored. But the cruelest part of his story was how avoidable it all was. Because when that trooper plane had flown overhead, the one Carl believed would save him, the pilot did see him. He saw the orange sleeping bag. He saw the man on the shore. And when Carl raised one arm into the air and pumped his fist, the pilot saw that too. And he smiled. Because according to international rescue codes, one arm raised meant all okay, do not wait. If Carl had only raised both arms, if he had only known, the pilot would have landed. He would have gone home. Today, decades later, hikers and bush pilots still talk about Carl McCunn. His diary, recovered from that frozen tent, has been published and read around the world. A window into the mind of a man facing isolation, regret, and the bitter edge of hope. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't foolish. He was just human, chasing something bigger than himself, trusting that the world would meet him halfway. And in the end, all it took was one small misunderstanding, a single gesture, to turn his dream into a tragedy. Maybe that's the haunting truth buried in this story. It's not the wilderness that killed Carl McCunn. It was silence. Silence. Between one man and another, between signal and meaning, between "I'm okay" and "please save me." And that silence, in the vast loneliness of Alaska, was louder than anything else in the world. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Carl's story reminds us how fragile our connections really are, how even the smallest mistake can change everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves true survival stories. And if you want to hear about another incredible real-life mystery, one that'll keep you thinking long after it's over, click on the next video right here. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, not every silence means you're alone.